In the 1930s, movies became an even bigger business. Studios introduced sound films and radically reshaped movie making. Hollywood retooled itself on the model of the factory assembly line. The studios cranked out movies with almost the same speed that Henry Ford mass-produced cars. I don't want it good, Jack Warner declared. I want it Tuesday.
You now needed an industrial system to make this all work. In the first 20, 25, 30 years of cinema, large numbers of editors were women. It was considered to be a woman's job because it was something like knitting, it was something like tapestry, sewing, that you took these pieces of fabric, which is what film are, and you put them together. It was when sound came in that the men began to infiltrate the ranks of the editors because sound was somehow electrical. It was technical. It was no longer knitting.
There is the soundtrack, which might be several tracks, and the image. And without the happy marriage of those two, you're not using every bit of potential that you possibly can in editing a movie.
The scene in Horse Whisperer where Sam Neill and Kristen Scott Thomas there's an argument results because she is going to leave. The intent of the scene was to show that the marriage was foundering. And it was dialogue basically overlapping as they were speaking, so they were both mic'd. To make it even more dramatic, I even took out more air and made the overlaps more intense. I could do that because I had separate tracks to work with.
Are you a psychiatrist? He says it takes time.
Well, I don't care what he says. I cannot sit here and pretend everything's going to be all right.
I am
we
not
have to
pretending.
Do something.
I am trusting in people who know more about this than we do.
We are losing her.
In effect, by taking out all of the air in that particular dialogue scene, it did have kind of a suffocating effect because there was no respite. There was no air there. You couldn't take it. You couldn't draw a breath, and it became that much more intense because of it.
To me, sound is very important. I create a sound template that is both with sound effects and temporary music that evokes certain feeling. I've worked with Per Hallberg as a sound designer and with Ridley Scott. For example, in Black Hawk Down, the incursion of the Blackhawks entering into Mogadishu. It was almost like a ballet, a science fiction ballet. People landing on a different planet. I was not interested in hearing all the helicopters, only music, showing it from a subjective point of view. So this idea of science fiction, when I was putting the scene together, just inspired me to use almost no sound. I remember that the real Black Hawk pilots wanted to see the footage. So one day I just showed them an assembly. They were really moved. One guy, almost tear in his eyes, says, "Man, I don't know, this looks great. I got goosebumps." These were the guys that were there, you know, and it felt real to them.
There was a scene in Dante's Peak where Pierce Brosnan has to walk back through a long tunnel to his truck, and the tunnel is about to collapse. And you hear the sound, the little sound of sand like falling down the walls. So at one point, the music editor asked me for the scene, and she proceeded to put music on it. And I looked at it and I said, oh, that doesn't work at all. Because suddenly I'm hearing music and I'm not hearing all that stuff, that tiny little sand thing that makes me scared. If you were in a really dangerous situation, your ears would be so open and hearing every little tiny, tiny sound. If it just has music smooshed over it, it takes away that sense of listening with all your might. I mean, if I were the character, I'd say, turn that off, I can't hear.
The advent of sound expanded the editor's role in Hollywood. During the 30s and 40s, directors rarely came into the cutting room. The editing was controlled by the studios and their supervising editors. One of the most powerful was Margaret Booth, supervising editor at MGM for 30 years. Mastering the transition to sound, she caught the attention of legendary producer Irving Thalberg, who was the first to call cutters film editors, starting with Booth herself.
She oversaw all the production and had a say in almost everyone. But Maggie was probably the toughest and most feared woman at MGM. I mean, people would shudder when they hear that she was on the phone or she'd bust into the editing room, or you'd get a call, come down to room F, which is her room. You think, oh God, what have I done now? Margaret would tell the editors, it's your responsibility for the pace of the movie, it's your responsibility to get the best performances out of your actors. It's your responsibility to make it as good as you can. Margaret Booth, she used to say, if I feel there's a cut at a certain spot, whether it matches or not, cut. And you cut, he says, for the emotion. And if you will get away with so much by doing that. And I would hear her really yell at different editors who would say, oh, it doesn't match. She said, I don't care. Cut.
Booth, like other great studio editors of the era, helped create many of the stars of the golden age of Hollywood.